So you may remember a couple of weeks ago that Jacob Rees-Mogg was on Question Time and he made some interesting, to say the least, comments about the Boer War concentration camps. And I think this really needs to start a bigger conversation. It needs to start a bigger conversation about the reality of what the empire was like for other people, especially in the colonies. You know, that's, you know, how it should, you know, the conversation should certainly be. And we've said before, and time again, I keep on getting proved right. A lot of people like Jacob Rees-Mogg are, you know, they're pining for these, you know, lost imperial days that are never going to return. You know, their entire political basis is based on a Britain that existed in the past and will never exist again, because to make that, you know, Britain exist again, we will actually have to go out and exert proper military force to go out and reclaim essentially the British Empire, and that's not going to happen. But this comes from Al Jazeera, and this is Britain's belated reckoning with imperial crimes. Britain could not have won World War II without the massive exploitation and abuse it unleashed on its colonies, which is true. A massive famine in India caused by Winston Churchill. You know, this isn't talked about very often, and it does appear in, you know, in certainly larger discussions about what was going on socially and politically in history, but not so much in, shall we say, the war history, which to some extent I can understand. But I still think, you know, a lot of these things that happen do deserve a place in history and do deserve to be talked about. So this is by a guy called Elliot Ross for Al Jazeera. I've already mentioned the title. So on the February 13th, Al Jazeera English released a documentary called The Forgotten Heroes of Empire, which tells the story of the UK's scandalous neglect of its colonial era African soldiers. During World War II, Britain recruited through propaganda, coercion and promises of sizable compensation thousands of African soldiers to fight against Nazi Germany, Italy and Japan on some of the most brutal battlefronts across Africa, Asia and the Middle East. Using historical records and witness testimony, Al Jazeera investigation exposed the detrimental abuse and racism these soldiers experienced during their service, and highlighted the poverty and hardship the small number of surviving veterans and their families continue to endure in their homelands to this day. The film's central discovery is a file buried deep in the British National Archive, which reveals how the government systematically discriminated against African soldiers, paying white personnel, even those living in African colonies, and serving alongside African soldiers in British colonial units, up to 3 times more than their black counterparts. The revelations in this film received extensive media attention in the UK. Opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn called for an urgent inquiry, while other senior Labour Party figures lamented the utterly reprehensible treatment of elderly veterans, demanding that the government launch an investigation into this matter, issue a formal apology and pay the veterans the compensation. The Conservative government seems to believe that it has already paid its dues for the shameful mistreatment of the Commonwealth soldiers. Last year it attempted to address this by address the issue by announcing a 15 million aid package, with the Minister for International Development saying that the cash would be used to provide 2 meals a day and regular cash transfers to 7,000 veterans and war widows who served in the British Armed Forces across the Commonwealth. However, the government made no formal apology of neglecting these veterans and their families for decades. It also shamelessly framed what should have been compensation for wage theft coercion, and use of corporal punishment on African soldiers during World War II as a benevolent expression of gratitude and contribution to international development. While the current UK government's apparently reluctance to honesty to address the violations of the British Empire is disheartening, the debate the Al Jazeera film caused represents a significant and welcome shift in thinking. We have to take this opportunity to extend this conversation past World War II and the colonial army. So, the racialised wage struggle for serving soldiers in the British Armed Forces during World War II was not an aberration, as the shock expressed by prominent British politicians concerning this week's revelations actually might suggest. Indeed, it was a defining feature of the ruthlessly exploitative colonial labour markets through which the UK built up the capital that we still benefit from today. Across the British Empire, a primary function of the colonial administration was to terrorise and limit local populations as to produce large pools of extremely cheap native labour. Then colonial authorities valued European lives more than Asian and African would have been no revelation to the British public if it wasn't so structurally ignorant about the historical realities of colonialism. And it's true, we aren't really taught about colonialism and what it actually really was, especially not until you really go, I suppose, to a proper university level, which is why so many people are really historically ignorant about what went on in the British Empire, and particularly in the colonies. And this ignorance continues to be portrayed by politicians, historians, and the media. Just a day before the Al Jazeera film was released, the Times of London published an article by prominent politician and journalist Beryl Franklin, I think that's how you say it, Franklinson, titled "Even though the wartime Prime Minister was a lifelong white supremacist, his strengths far outweigh his weaknesses." Franklin's defence of Winston Churchill came in response to a televised debate in which his shameful role in the Bengal famine of 1943 was discussed. Churchill's played a central role in shaping prevailing British notions of modern history. As both grand imperialism and leader during World War II, he made possible an unlikely reframing of the British Empire as a benign historical project because he, an imperial Britain by extension, is supposed to have single-handedly saved Western civilization from the greater evil of Nazism. Such delusions about Britain's imperial and military history remain powerful cultural narratives that help perpetuate the ugly imperial politics and bigotry of exploitation today. The documents from the colonial archives that were presented in the Al Jazeera film are indeed evidence of racial discrimination in colonial Britain, but they are not unique. Any colonial historian can attest that the archive is chock full of files which detail the official racial prejudice extending way beyond the army. Like military personnel, civilians too were extensively abused and exploited in mines, construction sites, plantations, etc. across the British colonies. Deeply exploitative and forced industrial labour was an everyday feature of the British colonial rule, buttressed by the racist notion that work has a civilising effect on native workers. In Kenya, for example, the British counterinsurgency strategy against the anti-colonial Land and Freedom Army during the 1950s centred on violently extracting labour from peasants who had been driven from their land by white settlers, had resisted taking up the starvation wages on offer from colonial labour markets. While African soldiers helped Britain win the war against the Axis, civilians across the colonies helped it amass wealth, the benefits of which we still enjoy on the island. Recent estimates by economists figure that this is about 45 trillion in today's money on British theft from India between 1765 and 1938. There are no figures for Britain's colonies in Africa, however. We do not know that there was the same kind of collusion between the British government and the private interests in African colonies aimed at extracting wealth and impoverishing ordinary African workers. The whole enterprise was underpinned by a shared ideology of white supremacy and entitlement. As the Brexit crisis is creating dreams of Empire 2.0 in the minds of the population and political establishment, dreams of renewing lucrative connections with the Commonwealth countries and past economic and military glory, we need to urgently reassess our understanding of the British Empire and its crimes. We have to acknowledge and interrogate the causes, not just of the extreme violence, the torture and other atrocities people suffered at the hands of the Empire, but also the systematic exploitation by racist colonial structures which regulated many to a life in abject poverty and misery. Britain owes a debt to all its former colonial subjects and to their descendants. It is high time we take a serious and irreversible nature of the political and economic cultural entanglements produced by empire, of which military service is just one example. We must finally discard the jingoistic notions of this history that we've inherited from white supremacists such as Rudyard Kipling and Cecil Rhodes. The UK's trade and immigration policies should be a countermeasure with which our historical obligations to formerly colonised people. Such policies ought to be shaped by formal recognition of abuse and exploitations suffered by the societies across the world which are under British rule, and by a question of how to make amends. The story of how Britain stole from the African soldiers who fought the Nazis can help towards a necessary and long overdue reckoning with the enduring hatreds for which Britain bears for the enduring harms which Britain bears responsibility. And that is true. We do need to have this conversation, and as I keep on telling people, and I've told people this, since we've started covering Brexit way back in the day, this whole idea of Empire 2.0 is completely ridiculous, because it's based on this idealized notion that somehow, as soon as we leave the EU, all our colonial friends, colonial friends in quotation marks, are going to come swarming back to us, and somehow the Commonwealth is going to turn into this amazing industrial economical project, when it's not. That is not the function of the Commonwealth. It has no economic functions. So the idea that this is going to be accepted and that somehow Britain is going to lead this is not going to be accepted at all. I've already got a point to back when we first covered this. I can't remember the Indian minister's name, but he basically said, India is not going to become an imperial bazaar for the UK post-Brexit. So, and if anything, India isn't really going to want to trade with the UK. They're going to want to trade with the far bigger trading bloc that is literally on our doorstep. But, there you go. And you've only got to look at Japan. Japan has just done a trade deal with the EU as well. Where are they going to invest now? They're not going to invest in the UK anymore. They're going to invest in countries in the European Union more. And that's going to be a pattern for other countries. Why has Dyson decided to move out of the UK? If the UK is leaving the European Union, and as we have been told by many times by prominent Brexiteers that this is somehow going to initiate a revival of Britain, and that somehow we are going to become this amazing, economic power, why is Dyson, a big UK manufacturer, moving his operations out to Singapore?